hearts in the fast lane. We had big dreams in blue.
Hello all, and good morning on day 2. On behalf of my Pacific Northwest National Laboratory, National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and Department of Energy and Bureau of Ocean Energy Management colleagues, I am grateful for the opportunity today to share work from 2 federal offshore wind transmission planning efforts that have gone on in the last 2 years. It is the work of 2 national laboratories, more than 60 researchers, and 2 Department of Energy offices, and it has spanned the past 2 years, culminating in January publications. Though it's not the first element most think of when they hear offshore wind, the supporting transmission infrastructure holds the potential to greatly influence how benefits and costs of the opportunity are derived. And in the context of this morning, it should be noted that the expansive infrastructure builds, of which I will speak shortly, are only possible through robust port supply chain development. Today we'll be speaking about port and supply chain, particularly this morning. You can't build the transmission builds that we've studied in the West Coast study without significant port and supply chain infrastructure. The West Coast Offshore Wind Transmission Study followed the Atlantic Offshore Wind Transmission Study and the National Transmission Planning Study, and sprang out of a published literature review of 13 active and recent studies of offshore wind off of the West Coast, including the Californian, Oregon, and Washington coastlines. The key gaps the study sought to address to track the theme of pathways for development. Though multiple studies around the world encourage coordination of interconnections in the long term, these long-term end states, say in a far-off date such as 2050, are not conducive to near-term action in and of themselves. Both the study and the action plan sought to illuminate near and intermediate term steps toward that long-term future. The action plan resulted from 12 convening workshops which solicited input from tribal nations, federal and state agencies, cable and transmission providers, fisheries organizations, non-governmental organizations, developers, unions, utilities, and other ocean co-users on the aspects of transmission planning which were most meaningful and applicable to them. The convening was complemented by a request for information, which was published in the Federal Register, that allowed individuals and organizations to submit written inputs as well. Preliminary findings from the study, the West Coast Offshore Wind Transmission Study, were used to facilitate discussions. Based on this input, 56 unique recommendations were put forward, which were relevant to the West Coast context in the action plan, as well as there were 20 relevant actions cited from the Atlantic plan for the West Coast. Based on a geospatial analysis across the entire West Coast and modeling of interconnection hosting capacity and the wind resource, 5 topology sets resulted from a generation and transmission co-optimization in the study. And hopefully we'll be able to show you those in a moment here. These offshore optimums were married with onshore transmission plans of the California Independent System Operator, PacifiCorp West, and the Bonneville Power Administration. Starting in 2035, where capacity expansion optimization indicated the need for 15 gigawatts of offshore wind in the generation mix, 13 of that 15 were in California, and the other 2 were in Oregon. A distributed topology set, which brought offshore wind to 9 different points of interconnection, was contrasted with a concentrated topology set, which used only 5 of the same points of interconnection, or POIs. These interconnections were all radial in nature. These interconnections, so now we're talking about the concentrated topology set in 2035. These interconnections were all radial in nature. And when I use that term, what I mean is that transmission lines simply link the offshore wind plant to its corresponding point of interconnection, or POI, directly. In 2050, the radial counterfactual models purely radial interconnections for all 33 gigawatts of offshore wind supply. An alternate intra-regional topology set employs networks of high voltage direct current, or HVDC technology, within the California ISO and Pacific Northwest regions separately. Finally, the inter-regional set incorporates full coordination across the West Coast through multi-terminal HVDC networks and high voltage alternating current, or HVAC, transmission. These 5 topology sets, and this is the important piece to track right now, these 5 topology sets span 6 different development pathways, as enumerated here on this slide. Note that the first of these, the one that is starred, was used as the reference pathway. In other words, we compared pathways 2 through 6 to pathway 1, the 2035 distributed to 2050 radial pathway. We assessed relative benefits as compared to this long-term march to a radial counterfactual. And this is what the topology sets look like. We made these subway-style maps with a green line representing HVAC, green lines representing HVAC transmission, orange lines representing HVDC, the stops on the subway being points of interconnection. In 2035, the additional POIs of Del Norte, Tesla, a Bay Hub in San Francisco, and Moss Landing are discernible in the distributed case as compared to the concentrated case. So these are the two on the left side of the screen here. The power flows are higher at several of the POIs for the concentrated case to make that same 15 gigawatts. However, 5 gigawatts was injected to the 500 kilovolt network near Diablo Canyon and Morro Bay in both cases in 2035, which was supported by our simulations. In 2050, more POIs emerge, as you can see, particularly in Oregon and Washington, and more HVDC. In the intra-regional case, dry or land-based multi-terminal HVDC is built, while in the inter-regional case, the multi-terminal HVDC is sited in the ocean. Crucially, in this case, the inter-regional case, a new connection is made between California and the Pacific Northwest in the inter-regional. 25 GIS layers and project advisors, some of which are in the room, thank you very much for your help, informed a friction surface to guide the cable routing optimization for these topology sets. White areas denote exclusions, such as water depths exceeding 4,000 meters, underwater canyons, and Department of Defense restricted areas. The orange shade represents varying levels of friction to discourage cable presence. Medium and high friction areas include rocky shorelines, shipping fairways, and uniformed and zoned multiple use marine protected areas. Generation was resolved in a similar manner but limited to 1,300 meter water depths. Generation was then force included in the existing lease areas as well. Surprisingly, as large as the Pacific Ocean seems, approximately 30 gigawatts could be deployed in the most favorable federal water in California and Southern Oregon before these constraints were violated. To exceed this amount of offshore wind, 30 gigawatts, waters deeper than 1,300 meters and thus further west, or water to the north with lesser wind resource would need to be pursued. Beyond the topology sets offshore, detailed onshore builds were completed as well, spanning the entire western interconnection. More than 300 gigawatts of supply was added between 2035 and 2050, much of it dispatchable hydrogen combustion turbines. 11 major onshore transmission projects, which are listed here, were modeled. People may be familiar with Boardman to Hemingway. There's several others in the table here on the slide, which were included. Dispatch solutions across every hour of the year, the model year, were obtained, and a representative set of these were carried to detailed power flow and dynamic simulations of critical contingencies defined by CAISO, PacWest, Bonneville, and the Western Electricity Coordinating Council. System reinforcements for reliability, not all due to offshore wind, of course, were concluded. Cost estimates were made of all reinforcements and included in the techno-economics. This approach yielded a benefit cost analysis at system scale, where 5 pathways to 2050, again, were compared to that one starred pathway, the 2035 distributed to 2050 radial counterfactual pathway. Coordination holds a net benefit exceeding $14 billion for the intra-regional case and $25 billion for the inter-regional pathways in terms of 2024 net present value. The cost of the transmission expenditure are outweighed by fuel and availability savings. Fuel savings accrued as higher cost of hydrogen combustion in Southern California in 2050 was offset by lower cost and not necessarily offshore wind resources through additional offshore wind transmission. The ability to redispatch in the event of contingency and flow power to shore through alternate paths on the offshore HVDC backbone of the inter-regional case provided additional benefits. Importantly, not much difference is seen in the 2035 concentrated to 2050 radial pathway compared to the 2035 distributed to 2050 radial pathway. The production cost savings are similar between the two 2035s, and the overall build cost, once reinforcements are considered, is similar. This means that there may be a potential to bring power benefits to more communities without restricting long-term or system-wide benefits. Finally, capacity contributions of the generation were shown to be robust in the study. Effective load carrying contributions values between 35 and 40% were assessed. However, offshore transmission did not provide any capacity benefit given the amount of onshore transmission which was modeled. Clearly, the study assumes significant HVDC on land and in the water. Though there are promising efforts internationally to mature the technology, coordinated HVDC remains emergent. The action plans from both the Atlantic and West Coast call for crucial standard setting on equipment ratings, data sharing, and interoperability. It also calls for an HVDC test and certification center, which could function as a facilitator of this technology. There are also recommendations around clarity on NERC, contingency standards, technology, commercialization, and supply chain that are worth noting here. And I encourage you to scan these and look up these action plans if you'd like to know more about those. In closing, please keep in mind that these topology sets and pathways should not be considered prescriptive or any one of them the answer. That is not our intent. We seek for them to be informed and plausible, and importantly, for them to be useful as a planning technique. There is more work to do in terms of technology development, geospatial analysis, interconnection design, community engagement, interregional coordination, and evolution of the onshore system, to name just a few areas. Transmission planners must operate with imperfect or incomplete information. How can they decide the next best action to take today? They may benefit through the consideration of development pathways through time, such as those shown here on this slide, defining near-term steps which support near-term net benefits and also preserve the option for longer-term net benefits for coastal communities and western states. So thank you for giving me some of your morning to hear about these two efforts. Please download the publications if you would like to learn more. Find me later today if you have any other further questions, and enjoy the remainder of the conference. Thank you.